we're going to talk about how to safely do the soldering things that you need to take care of your machine when you get to that point. So the first and most important step is to talk about safety, because you can hurt yourself with soldering. If you are careful, it's very unlikely, but if you're careless, you can be hurt pretty bad. The first step, of course, is safety glasses. You absolutely must have these. These are not an option. In my case, I'll have glasses, and it turns out that my glasses, safety glasses, go over my glasses, which is fine. Now, keep in mind, just glasses is not enough, because if you notice, if I've got little balls of solder flying, they can get around the edges of regular glasses. And so this is not good enough. You really need to have something with little sides on it, something that's going to cover your eyes. Now, you say, well, do I really care? I mean, so I get a little speck in my eye and it hurts for a while. You do care, because not only, I haven't had solder in my eye, I can only imagine how painful molten metal is in your eye. But if you go for an MRI, they will actually ask you, they will test you and ask you if you have had your eyes checked for any metal in your eyes. And the reason is because any tiny flake of metal in an MRI machine can actually move or burrow through your eye and possibly through your head, which would obviously cause a great deal of damage. So just don't put yourself in that circumstance in the first place. Glasses, safety glasses at all times, no matter what. So that's the first rule, is the safety glasses. The second that were not as crucial is you don't want to burn things with your iron. As a matter of fact, if you get carried away, you can actually catch the place on fire. So the goal, this iron's not on right now, so I'm going to take my glasses off. But the goal is, as a beginner, you may get in a nasty habit of reaching over carelessly and just grabbing the end of your iron. It'll be very memorable. Soldering irons work at about 260 degrees Fahrenheit, which is not an outrageously high temperature if you're comparing to things like open flame and welding and things like that. But 260 is still enough to burn you pretty handsomely and to also cause a fire. If this drops on the carpet and you leave it there, it may be 10 or 15 minutes, but there's a pretty good chance you can have a very large black mark and potentially catch the whole carpet on fire. So when you're, as a beginner, try to think twice. When you go to reach for the soldering iron, don't just carelessly reach over and grab for it. Look carefully every time you do that to make sure you're grabbing the iron by the handle so you don't burn yourself, because it's an unpleasant experience. You'll heal in a few days. You just don't want to go there. So the second part is, when you're doing anything, you're going to get distracted. So as you are using an iron in your machine and the phone rings, or you get called away for some reason, do not leave the iron on while you're gone. My own personal rule, if I leave the room, the irons are off. I strongly suggest you do the same, because you're going to get distracted, you're going to go answer that call, and the next thing you know, it took you an hour. The cat walked by, knocked the iron off the table. You have no idea what happens if you're gone for an hour. So always, keep that iron off if you leave the room. And when we're working on a machine's not the perfect place to use an iron, because it's a somewhat awkward place. I mean, this is a nice flat table where we have the iron holder, where we can keep the iron in the holder, and it's all nice and neat and clean. That's not the case in a pinball machine. What I'll typically do is, when the iron's hot, sometimes I'll just leave it lay over the side of the machine. You do have to be it's a very convenient place to put it while you're working, but you do have to be careful, because if it's leaning across the side of the machine like this, and you absent-mindedly put your arm next to it, you're going to find out in a real big hurry what burnt hair smells like, and it's not pleasant either. So by all means, hang it. You can actually put it on the bottom of the pinball machine if you're very careful not to let it to tip touch, in a convenient place. But always keep in mind, while you're working on that machine, where the iron is at all times. As a matter of fact, if you can, plug it in, get it hot, do the job, which usually involves taking some wires off, changing them apart, putting some wires on. When you're done, turn it off, put it away. I wouldn't even leave it sitting out if you don't have to. So that's the second part of not trying hard not to burn yourself in any way. So keep it put away if at all possible. So the next question comes down to solder. Now, solder for our purposes is not plumbing solder. You will not use plumbing solder. Solder that is used for plumbing uses very strong rosin and would cause a lot of damage to our circuits and wires. So when I say solder for wire, you're just looking for a normal electronic rosin type solder. This is called wire solder because it looks like a wire, but it's very soft. And if you took a magnifying glass and you looked at it very carefully, you would actually notice that it's hollow with a gel of rosin in the inside of the solder. And the reason is because that solder, when you use the solder, that little bit of flux is important to allow the solder to break through the oxidation on whatever you're soldering and make the solder flow onto the wire, onto the terminals. And that flowing is all it's all you need to make that solder joint look really nice and pretty. So stick with an electronic type solder. Radio Shack, of course, used to have such things. Today, many of the electronics distributors also have this. Make sure it's a rosin type solder. So if you're going to be doing some soldering, you're going to need a soldering iron, and a decent one at that. So most soldering irons are pencil style. Officially, a pencil soldering iron usually plugs into the wall. In this case, I have a soldering station, which doesn't just plug into the wall. It utilizes a base with an adjustment for the temperature. So in my case, I'll turn it on. My pencil has a base. The weighted base helps you keep things stable. Now I can adjust the temperature on my soldering station. You adjust it all the way to the top, it's great for melting stuff. It makes it much easier to melt stuff. Matter of fact, you can melt plastics pretty quickly. But the problem is, if you leave that on for a few hours, the tip begins to oxidize and turn grungy, and the next thing you know, you're throwing away a tip. Keep it too low, it makes it much harder to melt the solder on the item. So you'll find a happy medium. I usually don't put it at the very top, but close to it. So the station, you can adjust your temperature, which is really handy. Now, with the pencil iron, remember, you can't adjust it in any way, but that's fine. Now, if you're going to own a pencil iron, a soldering iron, you're going to find that the tips go bad all the time. Some people ignore that. The quality of the tip means everything to how well you're going to manage your soldering job and how smoothly things go. This tip, I haven't cleaned it yet, and it's got all sorts of crud on it, and it's clearly dark and nasty looking. So I'm not going to get anywhere with this. If you look at a brand new tip, I'll show you these tips right here. They're about $5 a piece. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to break the bank. But a brand new tip is bright and shiny. This tip that I've been using for a while, it looks gray and dirty. Now, as you solder, you will continuously clean that tip. Every time you go to use it, you will clean that tip. And there are really two ways to clean your tip. The first, you see the sponge that's in the holder, and you put a little bit of water in there, and then you just sweep the iron across the solder, across the sponge. The downside to the sponge is that the water cools the tip. So it'll cool it down, and then it has to warm back up. The other solution is a Brillo pad style that's in a base. Now in this case, it doesn't cool the tip. The only downside to the Brillo is that eventually it begins to wear away the plating. There's a plating of metal on the tip that once it wears away, it just oxidizes very quickly and it becomes not a very usable tip. Now, I can notice right now that my tip is not turning silver when I clean my tip. So I'm not going to use this tip. I refuse to frustrate myself because as you go to use that on a soldering joint, if it doesn't have a clean tip, if you can't wet it with the solder, you can hold that on the solder joint all day long, especially these old solder joints in these pinball machines that are 30 years old. They're not going to melt. and it's going to be very frustrating for you. So I'm going to turn my iron off, and I'm going to get out one of these beautiful new tips, and you're going to be jealous because my tip is going to be so bright and shiny. Get my solder out. Now that the iron is hot, I'm going to put my glasses on and my safety glasses on. So that's the first rule. Now, iron will be hot real fast here. I'm going to show you how, with the brand new tip, solder melts very quickly and very easily. So now that I have a brand new tip in here and I've got the iron back on, I've got my safety glasses on, I'm going to tin the tip. Use brand new solder to tin the tip. All you're going to do is touch the solder to the tip. Notice how it flows on quite easily because it's a new tip. Now I'm going to put an excess. And what's happening is the rosin in the solder is flowing onto the tip, making it easier for the tip to take solder. So we just put an excess on there until there's plenty on and it's all the way around both sides. It even falls off. Make sure when solder falls, it doesn't fall on you. If you're wearing shorts, you may get a painful experience. So I'm going to put plenty on, let the rosin do its job, and then I'm going to clean the tip on my sponge or my Brillo to make the tip nice and clean. So you notice the tip is cleaned off, but it's been tipped. It's been tinned. Okay, so before we get into working on real things, I want to show you for a moment the different tools that you can use to desolder, all right? All right? Probably the simplest tool for desoldering is called braid. It's a fine copper braid, and what you do is you essentially can remove solder. It's a little bit, you need to use a lot of braid to accomplish this, but essentially what you do is you solder with the iron, and then you dip the braid into the solder in order to absorb you'll watch the solder will actually wick. It's also called solder wick. You'll watch the solder wick into the braid, and you just keep pushing the braid in and absorbing the solder until you've absorbed as much solder as you need to remove. Okay. The second type of desoldering tool is the handheld solder sucker. They come in different brands and styles. This is the cylindrical metal one. There's also a big blue plastic style. They all have the same idea. They have a spring inside. You load them with your thumb and then click. You have to be very quick with these in order to get the solder. Notice the tip, and by the way, these tips are replaceable. So once you've melted this tip until it's terrible, don't just live with it. You can get replacement tips as well. But in order to desolder with this, once again, you're going to melt whatever the solder joint is that you're trying to melt. Then you're going to take the loaded desoldering, you're going to get that tip down so that it's touching the solder, and then pull the trigger, and it will have sucked up some of it. You may have to do it 3-4 times, but notice also it's hot in there. You can see the smoke coming out. Notice that when I push out the tip, sometimes a little bit of solder comes out. You can see that piece that's solidified from before. So I'm going to do it again. Melt the solder joint. Put your tip down and take up as much solder as you can. So we have our flipper mechanism taped down to the table, and I'm sitting in a nice comfortable chair, which is so easy to work on. You, on the other hand, will be working on a flipper mechanism that is upside down on a big piece of wood that is attempting to fall on you. So by all means, you have to take extra care when you're trying to work upside down. And part of that is, as we start to solder and desolder these terminals, you have to be careful because the solder is going to want to fall in droplets and actually fall on you. It may fall on your hand, that's not the end of the world, but by all means, don't forget you've got your safety glasses on because it will fall. wherever it wants. So let's assume for a moment that the first step is to remove these wires. One of them already fell off, but let's say we want to remove these wires from this mechanism. My first suggestion is take a Sharpie, and the goal is to mark the wires, because it's going to be very difficult if you mix up these wires. You're going to have to get out schematics, get out ohm meters, and try to figure out which wires went where, and that's not an easy thing to do. So it's much easier up front to mark the wires and not have to worry about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to arbitrarily choose this end of the coil as my dot. We'll call that 1 and put a little dot there. This wire's gone already. I would have put a 1 on that, but this wire is the second wire. I'm going to put 2 black marks on there. Get them dark enough so you can clearly see them. And then this is the third terminal, and I'm going to put 3 marks on this wire. Marks aren't going to hurt a thing, and they may wind up saving your ass. So I've got 2 marks, 3 marks, and 3 marks because there are 2 wires in this terminal. That's going to make it a lot easier to follow when you go to put it back together again. All right. So the next step, I'm going to start with the third terminal, and we're going to remove this. Now, as I indicated before, these terminals, if they haven't been touched, are probably 20, 30, even longer years old, and the solder tends to turn very gray, very oxidized, and it's difficult to take the solder off like that. Just a separate note, the solder, if I were to put a little extra solder on to the terminal, it helps you get things to flow. And the reason that it helps it to flow is because you're adding a little bit of rosin, which helps get things wetted and flow through, the heat flows through. But having said that, there is also a rosin pen, and these are not that terribly expensive. If you buy a rosin pen, they're nice. Now I made a big mess. But you dab a little bit of rosin on the solder joint, and that actually, you'll find, makes it much easier, as you can see, to get the solder joint hot. So I'm going to use the handy soldering tool to take the solder off the second terminal. Then we're going to heat it up, get it nice and hot, and suck. So if you notice, we've got the right angle up here. If you notice, we have, not only did the wire fall off, which is unfortunate, I wanted to show you the wires attached, but not only did the wire fall off, we removed the solder, and you can actually see the hole. I'll put a wire through the hole. You can actually see the wire goes through the hole of the terminal. That's ideal, because when you go to put your wires back on it, you're going to have a fresh connection. You're going to wrap those through the hole and around and solder them on. That's what you really want, is to have them clean enough to get the wires through. We'll do it to the third one as well. Yep. Okay, you can just see there's a little bit of wire left on here. That's actually the diode that they wrapped around. But there's enough solder taken off that you can see, once again, the hole clear through the terminal to let you put the wire through the terminal. Okay. Oh, I made a mess of rosin everywhere. All right. One thing I want to explain to you is that the wire, when the wires are on here, in our case, our wires just fell off. But that's not usually going to be the case. In this case, what I want to illustrate to you is that the wire is typically, pretend this is stripped wire. And that wire, when it's on here, let's say it's wrapped around, or it's even through the hole, etc., and you're trying to take this wire off. You may be able to melt the solder, but the wire is still wrapped here somehow. And as you try to pull hard on the wire, what's going to happen is that wire will suddenly come free of that terminal as it bends away. And what's going to happen is, as the wire comes free of the hole or the terminal, it'll flick, and molten solder can fly through the air. That can be very painful if you let that solder flick in through the air. So what you really want to do is you want to loosen that up. You can even go in there and pull the wire out and unloop it. But what you want to do is you ultimately want to be able to pull the wire through the hole loosely without having to yank on it and apply pressure and spring load that wire so that it has that flicking action. Okay, so I want to discuss stripping wire first. I have a nice piece of new wire. You won't always have a chance to work with brand new wire, but the thought is the same. In this case, I can actually read on the wire where it says 16 AWG, which is 16 gauge wire. 16 would be something you would use on a flipper mechanism, something with more current, a coil. You'll actually get up into the 20 gauge, 22, 24 gauge wire when you're talking about a switch or a lamp, because they're thinner wire that takes less current. But in our case, we have a 16 gauge wire. I prefer this type of stripper, although you can get wire strippers in many different shapes and sizes. This is my favorite. And you'll see that on the stripper themselves, there are markings as to what gauge wire. That's a good starting point. That's not always the final answer that you want, but it's a good place to start. Now, I'm going to start where it says 16. I'm going to give it a good squeeze and pull, and that actually came off very nicely. Now, I didn't have to pull really hard, which means you're in too big of a hole, and I didn't cut off any of the strands of wire, which means I wasn't in a hole that was too small. I was in, baby porridge was just right. I was in just the right size hole to pull that insulation off. So that's a nice clean strip. When we're dealing with our old wires from our old mechanism, you are literally going to cut all that old garbage off and start with a nice fresh end on the wire and strip them so that you have some nice clean wire to work with in the first place. So I have my wire. I've stripped it about 3/8 of an inch, which is adequate. You might add a little more, add a little less. But notice that if I don't put any solder on the wire, when I go to bend that wire, notice how the braid comes apart, because they're all individual tiny strands of wire. We don't want that to fray apart when we're applying it, when we're putting the wire back onto the flipper mechanism. So I'm going to cut this again and strip it again. Okay. I'm going to give it a little bit of a twist. Okay, we're back to our 3/8 of an inch of wire. I'm going to tin that wire so that it doesn't fray apart. I'm just going to lay the iron on here for a moment, clean the tip, lay the iron on the wire, just put a little bit of solder. I didn't have to push at all. I just put a little bit of solder. That's putting heat into the wire, letting it get hot, and then I'm going to put more solder until it flows easily into the wire. Has to be hot to do this. You don't just briefly put the iron on. I'm leaving the iron on there, putting the solder on, leaving the iron on, and it's letting the solder flow into the wire. That solder has flowed completely into the wire. Now that that wire is tinned, I can use some needle nose, and notice how I can take just the tip, wrap it, and I've created a loop that I can put through the eye of the terminal on the coil. So we are back to our flipper mechanism. Let's assume for a moment that the purpose of your repair was a bad coil. So I'm assuming that you have replaced this coil. In reality, we're soldering back to the original. But in your case, you've probably replaced the coil and you're putting the wires back on the coil. Now, we tinned the wire to make it easier to put it through the eyelet of the coil. In my case, just for grins, I've marked the two bands with my marker, and I'm going to put it on the second terminal, because in your case, you will have those marks on there so that you remember which wires went where. So if you notice, I can easily, now that it's been tinned, I can put it through the eyelet, turn it around slightly. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take my needle nose pliers I'm going to squeeze that a bit, just so that it goes through the loop and back, nice and snug without a big gap in the middle. And now it actually holds itself in that eyelet fairly well. Then I'm going to take my iron and my solder. Now, once again, wipe your tip so it's nice and fresh. You're going to touch your iron to both the wire and the terminal at the same time. Give it a moment to get warm. Sometimes it helps to put one little dab of solder. The heat begins to flow very easily. I'm touching the wire and the terminal at the same time. Don't be afraid to leave the iron on there for a moment. Now I'm going to begin putting solder on both halves of the wire and the terminal at the same time. You do not necessarily have to completely fill that eyelet, but you want to make sure that wherever the wire touches, it's fully covered. And I'm going to let my iron loose. Quite literally, if I left that iron on there for maybe 30 seconds, I run the risk of melting the plastic where the eyelet is attached. But in this case, I didn't have to keep it on there that long. I have slightly blackened the insulation, but that's not unusual. But notice that I have no bare strands showing in my solder joint. My solder joint's fully covered with solder. It's fully attached to the eyelet. And if I pull on my wire, notice that it is fully securely attached to the eyelet. You can bend that back like this, that's fine. But notice how the solder joint itself did not pull apart or otherwise come apart in any way. It's nice and fully wetted with solder.